What is a redistributive economy? Like when we talk about what are components of early civilization. And it'll also give us a chance to talk about like the Hittites, some of these later Bronze Age empires who were all redistributive economies. The Bronze Age is the era we're talking about now, where our earliest civilizations pop up. And now keep in mind that when we say early civilizations, we're not saying that there weren't other humans all over the place, right? There are other societies and communities all over the place. So that's who we're trading with in like early Sumeria and Egypt. It's just because Sumeria and Egypt organized and they used the written word and they organized so highly, so quickly under a leader, and because they, had an abundance of grain to trade, they could set up what we term as civilization. And so hopefully by now you know that civilization actually means something fairly specific. It doesn't mean just a group of people, because we could have societies all over the place that we wouldn't call a civilization, but there are a bunch of people gathered together. They smelt copper, they have buildings, they talk to each other, they trade, they might even have boats, that sort of thing, but we won't call them a civilization just because they don't have those components to really construct that early organized urban society that became later civilization as we know it. So hopefully that's a little more clear that civilization actually does imply some specific things. It doesn't just mean a big group of people, right? Like when we talk about the early societies, we say that organized labor was crucial. And so leadership was also crucial because it needed that leadership to really organize. Well, redistribution is right along with that concept. And why in the early societies do we have redistribution and not simple taxation? All right? The reason is because, one might be that we don't have currency. So we don't have an abstract way to symbolize goods and services that we can then take and give to the king, right, in the form of taxation. And then the king can spend that money on goods and services and soldiers. We don't have currency, right? We don't have a way to abstract assets if you're into economics, that sort of thing. But what we do have are the actual goods and services themselves. That's the basis of a redistributive economy. We know this through text. We have records that catalog goods. We also have archaeology. And so in these late Bronze Age societies, in this stage of civilization, our architecture reflects the culture. So since we've really only emphasized Egypt and Sumeria, let's talk about some of the later empires before the Bronze Age collapse. Now, the ancient world experienced a dark age, just like we did in, say, Europe. We had a dark age in the Middle Ages, but that was AD. This is BC, right? A dark age. And this collapse came because the Bronze Age ended, the Iron Age began, the civil unrest, there were actual environmental issues, environmental disasters, a loss of productivity, a loss of organization. There were a lot of sea peoples who were simply raiding coastal cities and that sort of thing. And so the Bronze Age collapses and creates a dark age. And when we reemerge, we have a lot of societies that try to look back at some of the architecture and some of the oral traditions and create a mythology around it almost. So a lot of our myths and heroes come from this Bronze Age, but it's the actual post-Bronze Age, early Iron Age civilizations who are writing it down, all right? So we actually get a lot of myth and fiction tied in with obscure memories and oral traditions. And that's basically what Homer's Iliad and Odyssey was. It was an oral tradition that lasted a very, very long time, and they're stories of the Bronze Age told by people in the Iron Age. When we talk about Homer and the classical era, we're talking about an oral tradition that was eventually, after hundreds of years, was written down. Actually, the person who decided to codify and conventionalize Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the heroic epic tales of the Bronze Age, was a tyrant in Athens who decided to have these oral traditions written down. But I won't go any further with that. So we know about Sumeria and Egypt, the Minoans. Some ancient peoples thought they were Atlantis. They just disappeared, and they were highly advanced seafaring folk. But over here is a long island known as Crete, and Greece is right up here. So the Cretans, if you will, had a lot of contact with Greece. They influenced Greek culture. And they also had a lot of contact with Egypt and all these coastal areas. They're very wealthy. They leave behind very interesting paintings and frescoes. They were obsessed with bulls. They had a group of young men and women who would do something that was a cross between bull riding and like, what's that called? Bullfighting, yeah, thank you. It's sort of an ancient bullfighting, bull riding thing where the bull would run at you, and then you would run at the bull, and then do like a flip over its head, and then end up on the other side of the bull. So we have a ton of artwork about this obscure athletic event that must have been like quite the spectacle. It probably drew a crowd to have all these acrobats. It was probably like a circus, right? Circus animals. But it was with a bull. And we actually get the legend of the Minotaur from these peoples. On their island, many of their structures were built like a labyrinth. They're built into the ground. And so we have the Greek legend of the Minotaur in the labyrinth, based on observations of Greeks when they go through these ruins of seeing all these labyrinth-like underground rooms that just maze-like move throughout the entire city, actually. A lot of these buildings are interconnected. So through archaeology, we get myth. But when we really look at the archaeology and think about redistribution-based societies, we see it very clearly what's going on with redistribution. So redistribution, here's what it is. You've got a ton of farmers and craftsmen who are making products. You take a percentage of that, a rather large percentage in these early societies, and you put it in your main temple or palace. And so the Minoans were known to be what's called a palace society. And the palace was simply filled with a bunch of extra rooms to store goods. So it's almost like you have granaries and oil casks behind your own throne room. The head guy. And you see this with Mycenaean culture in Greek, the early Bronze Age Greeks. They were the same way. And then if you go over to Crete, to Knossos, you see similar structures. You see all these great storerooms. And so your products that we're really looking at are mainly grains, but then you get your oils. With your Mediterranean societies, it's olive oil. And you get all these other products. So redistribution is almost like a form of taxation, right? Or even a tithe. You take these goods, and in times of need, you can redistribute grain and that sort of thing to your own people that are in need. But really, economically speaking, for the leader, your surplus can go and trade for metals, precious metals, things that you need. Also, you have to have at-hand goods to have an army. You have to, like any army, even one that goes out these days, they have to have a supply line. They have to have a way to get food and that sort of thing. And so if you're going to wage war, you do have to store some goods and bring those with you on wagons. When you talk about redistributive economy, it's not just trade, it's also the military and the wealth of the king and the leaders themselves. So if you can imagine a society where you're a farmer or you're a craftsman who works with copper jewelry, you'll find yourself basically working for the king. Your employer is the king, and a huge percentage of your product goes right to the palace where that's redistributed for the reasons I mentioned: war, trade, famine, and wealth. Do all four of those make sense? Can you explain how all those relate to redistribution?
War, trade, famine, wealth.
Mycenaean civilization was highly influenced by the Minoan civilization. You see a similarity in architecture. And these existed at the end of the Bronze Age. So at the end of the Bronze Age, the Greeks as we know them didn't exist yet. But the predecessors to the classical and archaic Greeks were the Mycenaean Greeks. These are actually your heroes from the Iliad and the Odyssey: Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, Ajax, Paris, and so many others. And so the Greeks would actually look back at the oral traditions preserved in the late Bronze Age before the collapse, before the ancient Dark Age, and they actually preserved the stories of their heroes and their gods from that much earlier era. Very interesting story. In terms of literature and epic traditions, we've got some very strong epic traditions from the Bronze Age. We get the Epic of Gilgamesh. Yes? Once that Bronze Age collapse happened, a lot of these cultures were just cut off. And so at the reemergence of the Greeks and so many of these other cultures, they had to, all that survived was like oral traditions and architecture. So they actually had to make up a lot of the stuff that happened. So a lot of the stuff in Homer and in religious oral traditions, and when they view like old Thalos tombs that the Mycenaeans left behind, the Greeks look at those and they invent, you know, oh, this is a tomb for the hero Ajax. Well, they don't know that, have no idea. They just make this stuff up. So a lot of this Bronze Age stuff is repurposed and recycled into myth and fiction in your Greek epic traditions. So if I wrote down flood season on your paper, there are several components that you'll need to know for flood season that answers most of your questions, quite honestly. A lot of your information can be built around the idea of the flood season. Here's why. Flood season. The flood is good. Don't hear flood and think it's all bad. It's actually necessary in these areas. Okay, so you need the flood for soil. There's no rain here. No rain. If there is, it's very little. So this means there's a short window for growing. Because remember, their normal soil is very bad. It's when the floods come, they leave a deposit of what? Yeah, it is a sediment, actually, yeah. It's an alluvial soil. That's your key word. Alluvial soil. But it leaves a short window for growing when that alluvial soil is left behind after the floods. But it gives you an abundant supply of grain, which means that there's enough for trade and wealth left over. But it's not like they're in a place that's always good. Because you only live on each side of the river, the good land is very limited. So in these early civilizations, all the good land's taken. So you need a leader, let's say. We usually just say king. You can say king. You need a leader to organize and regulate because of this flood season. So this is where you get laws, and most of your early laws are to protect farmers, and they're about digging canals. You don't think necessarily in terms of urban sort of laws that we have. They're really about protecting the farmer. And so inside of this idea of the flood season, you get the idea of organization because you need, here's a good keyword for you, mass labor. That's how we spell labor in the US. See how all that works together? And so you could actually write a paragraph that tells you why you need a king, and why the king is needed for organization, how temperamental the flood really is, right? And so at this point, you can talk about why people use the sky, moon cycles, star cycles, you know, seasonal cycles. Why are they so observant of those things? Because of the flood season. It has to do with survival. It's not just, say, spirituality or what have you. It has to do with survival, understanding the flood seasons. So you can tie all those together. I mean, that can be your central idea that explains it all. Yeah, usually your city and your important buildings are on a higher area to prevent flooding. But in Sumeria, floods were really unpredictable. But a lot of times these floods would never flood your house. They would just flood certain designated basins and canals. And you would take a shovel, you and your whole family and all your neighbors would take shovels and dig canals, basically irrigation ditches, and so you channel that water into your yard. Sometimes there was too much flooding, and yeah, it would just flood everything. But if everything worked out well, the floods would be really controlled. I know when we hear floods, if you grew up in the Midwest and you hear the word flood, you're thinking wide scale, major devastation. You've got a boat in front of your house and you're on top of the rooftop, you know. But maybe think in more mild terms for some of these people. Keep in mind there were major floods in the early Bronze Age, late Neolithic. We still had some glaciers receding, and so occasionally you'd have a glacier that would create a flood in a certain area. So we know, for example, actually where we get our earliest flood myths in this area, the civilization that lived around here, we know the Persian Gulf did flood at one time. And if that coincided with the normal floods, then yeah, you could actually flood a huge area and think that the whole world is buried in water, right? And so this is where we get our early flood myths in that area. And so people were very aware of flooding, of course, You know, actually, if you look in some of your earlier texts that have to do with flood myths, a lot of popular memory would have us think that a lot of rain came down. But if you really look at your old texts and that sort of thing, they talk about water coming from the ground, which is more consistent with the water you get in Mesopotamia. It's from the ground, it's from rivers, it's not from the sky. You know, different mentality, of course. Remember when I was talking about how you need mass labor for the pyramids and the ziggurats and that sort of thing? That is only possible because you have mass organization for all these farmers in the growing season. But these mass building projects happen in the off season. So if you're controlling all this labor and you're not active, so you have all this labor, farmers, the farming season is over, now what do you do with them? Because you have so much control over their lives and what they do and your say in things. It's a redistributive economy, so you have an intimate connection with each household and how goods come to the center, how they come to your palace. So you can see where it'd be much easier to take these people and have them go haul rock or bake clay stones to make a ziggurat or build the pyramids. So it's this early phase of civilization that we're mass labor, you can say, in the off season is where we get our great feats. Pyramids at Giza. So that ties in rather nicely. So therefore, if it wasn't for the flood season, this high organization wouldn't have even started. You have to have organization of that labor. And it's the only way they can survive. They you know, during the flood season, they have to be organized and they need protection because the land, remember, everybody's jam-packed into all this good land. And your neighbors will exploit you. You know, if there's no legal protection, your neighbors will exploit you at some point. One of your neighbors will. And you have to have protection because you're so tightly packed. And it has to do with the limited amount of good area in that flood season. Because if it was an area that simply got good rain and had good soil, people could be spread out. There would be plenty of land, right? So there isn't plenty of land.